Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hat Collecting Talk Show. You're watching the video portion on YouTube, or maybe you're listening to it in podcast form. Just to also let people know, the platform that we're using here has some built-in audio processing, so it's given a bit of mixed results so far, as you've probably heard. I'm trying to get that straightened out so that you get better consistent sound. But with that all said, I am happy to be joined today by Jade Pichette, who is an inclusion, diversity, and belonging professional based in Toronto or Toronto. They are manager of programs at Pride at Work Canada, Gythia of Vindicere Kindred, and a queer community activist. For the podcast listeners, Jade's pronouns are they and them. So yes, thank you for joining me today, Jade.
Thanks, Lacey.
As you would know, the people that are kind of more regular watchers will know, we have a kind of a regular series of questions that we go through. And the first one that gets us started is, what are you currently up to? What are you currently working on?
I've been spending a lot of time on my day job as a career queer, pro homo, transfer pay, whatever you want to say, at Pride at Work Canada. So I've been focused mostly on working with employers around LGBTQ2+ inclusion. And as you might imagine, we just finished Pride season because our Pride season starts with Winnipeg Pride at the end of May and goes until Calgary Pride, which is the first weekend of September. So it was a very busy summer, even though we were all online. But now I'm working on creating our 2021 program plan and working on a few different projects in connection with that. So for instance, even just earlier today, I was on 2 calls with 2 different large employers here in Canada, one about creating their trans inclusion plan that they're going to roll out to all their offices, and another about they're creating an employee resource group for LGBTQ2+ employees so that they can further advocate internally within their organization. We're looking for a bit of support on that. So that's kind of where a lot of my time is being spent right now, is doing that. But I certainly have a lot of other projects on the go.
Yeah, absolutely. And since it was included in your bio, and I'm sure, because I didn't know all these things, this show is ultimately geared towards learning and teaching the audience. So did you want to explain a little bit more about what the Gythia of Vindicere Kindred is?
Yeah, so Gythia is roughly translates to priestess within Asatru, or also people call it heathenry. So it is essentially the pre-Christian beliefs of Northern Europe. So we are polytheists. We believe in multiple gods. We're animists. We believe that there are spirits in the land. We call them landvetir. And within that role, I'm responsible for creating spaces and rituals for members of my community, and occasionally get asked to do things for other people in other communities, especially queer folks, because certainly trying to find clergy members that are inclusive, let alone members of the community, being queer and trans is pretty rare. So having somebody who's going to affirm you. So for instance, last year I did a couple of weddings, one of which was explicitly based on from my religious community, from a couple in Peterborough. And then there was a couple in London, Ontario, who I'm friends with, but don't necessarily identify explicitly as members of my religious community, but still wanted me to do the ceremony for them. So lately that's been definitely a bit different, seeing as a lot of ceremonies just have not been happening because of COVID. But I was recently helped organize a international heathen gathering where we had 15 countries represented, including Canada, the US, Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, UK, Spain, Germany, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand. Somebody was even from Japan joined us, and Ukraine as well. So certainly things are a bit different in terms of my Gythia work or Priestess work, but generally that isn't necessarily for pay, although sometimes for a wedding or some type of ceremony like that, I will accept money. But it's generally not. It's something I do because I love my community. I love the tradition. But yeah, so that's what that looks like. But it's definitely a bit different right now.
Absolutely. And so I just want to, again, for the podcast listeners, I'm trying to be more mindful of, this COVID situation has us, pretty much all of us, kind of, doing everything from home, or most of my guests are at home when we record. So please do be a little bit more patient and forgiving of ambient noise that we don't have control over, like sirens or, things like that. Hopefully there won't be too many of those. I had that one time, there was like helicopters and motorcycles, and it's just like, where are all these coming from? But yeah, so you did touch upon the difference between, or how things have kind of changed since COVID started. And that's something I've been starting to examine on the more recent episodes, specifically with the work that you do. I guess you can look more at maybe the pride at work stuff. How has that changed since the pandemic happened?
It's changed radically. I mean, none of us with the Pride at Work Canada team were really expecting to go the direction that we went, obviously, because we weren't expecting to have to cancel in-person events, because we had events planned in 11 different cities across the country. And so those in-person events would usually be attended by either myself, my executive director, Colin Drouin, or our program assistant for Quebec, Florence Gagnon, who's in Montreal. And usually it would be one of the three of us, but mostly Colin or myself. And so normally I would be traveling a lot. This is the longest I've spent in the same city since I don't remember when. I think I was a teenager the last time I spent this much time in the same city. It's a very weird experience for me. But we had to cancel, all of those things, and we went online. And so starting in mid-March, we decided that we would do an online event every week. And we did that for most of the summer. And for April and May, we actually opened up our programming to the public, because we thought, so many queer and trans folks, especially, lost their jobs under COVID. And we actually have stats that say that, queer and trans folks are more likely to have lost their jobs during COVID in Canada than people who are not part of the community. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into all of which right now, but as a result, we wanted to provide space for some people. And there were some people who came back and said, like, this is the one thing that I'm looking forward to every week, which, when you're doing like programs on employment and corporate workplaces isn't what you expect to hear, right? Like, my background is in social work. So I'm used to hearing that from like, in-person programs, support groups, like counseling programs, things like that, but not from a corporate inclusion perspective. And yet it was filling the space for some people, which I'm grateful for. So we decided, instead of doing in particular our 11 Pro Pride events in different cities, we'd do 5 big ones online. And so we did 5 big virtual Pro Pride events around 5 different topics. So queer and trans women leading the way, Two-Spirit inclusion in the workplace, LGBTQ inclusion in the skilled trades, because the skilled trades is not exactly the most inclusive industry, queering the future of work, and one in French on Gen Z being queer and trans on the job, and looking at queer and trans youth and bringing in young LGBTQ talent and what that experience is like for them. And so we decided instead, let's get some punchy big name speakers. And it actually allowed us to do some things that we weren't able to do if we were just doing in-person events, including, connecting with people who are in smaller municipalities, who are, in cities that normally we don't work in. Like I got to talk to people from the Northwest Territories this year, which like normally I haven't gotten to work with anybody up there. We heard more from people in different parts of the country than we normally do. So it's certainly been a weird time, but mostly good one. Now that we've hit September, we're kind of more back to our regular programming schedule-ish, but with everything still being online, of course. So not a thing every week, but not that far off.
Yeah. I was gonna actually ask because obviously a lot of plans changed, but I do know that there have been some positives that have come out of changed plans from the pandemic. Like this very show was kind of reconceived from its original intended form, and I think it was for the best. So I was kind of curious with your work. Can you think of any specific ways in which having to kind of pivot on the fly unexpectedly has resulted in some great results that may not have otherwise happened?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely ended up hearing from some people and being able to get some people to be some of our speakers that normally we wouldn't be able to get. So I think of, for instance, Jarrett Lehman, who runs the Turn Technologies and the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology. Normally with his work schedule, he's never able to really come to our things, but we were actually able to get him in. We're also starting to make more inroads with politicians as well. And we've had politicians at some of our previous events. So for instance, last year for Victoria Pro Pride, we had actually the mayor of Victoria, Mayor Lisa Helps, who's an out member of the community, on our panel. But we were able to get some other folks this year that normally we wouldn't be able to get. And also we started to hear from some folks. It's a very weird experience when an MPP calls you, and not as like a fundraising call or like a political call of actually they've taken notice of the work that we were doing, and
awesome.
wanted to get involved. So it's some of those pieces has been really neat in terms of being able to get speakers and also make sure that whatever panel that we do is intersectional, right? Mm-hmm. Because sometimes it's harder, especially as I'm somebody who's working in Takaranto or Toronto, within the Dish with One Spoon territory. I may not know a lot of speakers in certain parts of the country who are marginalized in different ways. Like I know a lot of queer folks of color who are amazing speakers here in Toronto and in some of the other major cities that I might not know in smaller towns. And it's not to say that those speakers don't exist. It's just I haven't had the experience to get to know them, and I'm always looking for new potential speakers. But it's really allowed us to make sure that no matter what we're doing, we're able to have it be intersectional around a number of different areas, including race, indigeneity, disability, and more. Which when you're working only in one community and looking for speakers only from that community is sometimes harder to do. So that's also been a kind of a neat piece.
Yeah, that's great. So you kind of touched upon something there that I did want to try to start incorporating into this show. I know a lot of my guests so far have been fellow, not all of them are actually natively from Toronto, but I'm looking forward to talking to other guests from different parts of the continent or even the world, and to talk about. First time I'm testing for the podcast listeners, I've put up a banner on the screen that says land acknowledgement. And this is something that I just looked into and learned more about myself this year for the first time. Because I had heard about it. It started to become a much more regular thing, especially at queer events and LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit events, inclusive events, I should just say. And it's something that a friend of mine posted a video on Instagram at one point and just said, this isn't something that you should just go and like, print off the internet and just read verbatim. It's something you should actually go and research yourself so that you understand it. And if someone asks you, you could actually answer them as opposed to, oh, hold on, let me go find the note. So yeah, I wanted to just kind of acknowledge, I don't know if you're native to Toronto.
So I was born and raised on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, also today known as Ottawa. And that's originally where I'm from, where I got my start in terms of LGBTQ inclusion work, was back in Ottawa in 2003, 2004. In that, I try to recognize that, I am of mostly white settler descent. I see myself as an uninvited visitor to the dish with one spoon territory, being Toronto or Takaranto, which is traditionally home of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, and that there's ongoing relationships. And also Toronto is home to the largest Indigenous community in Canada, which a lot of people don't realize. There are a lot of Indigenous folks here in Toronto from across Turtle Island, but I do see myself as an uninvited visitor on this territory, and I hope, Indigenous people can correct me if I'm wrong, that in the work that I do, that I, provide enough space for Indigenous people to tell their own stories and to address the fact that we're still living in a colonial space. And we need to be doing work on that, especially those of us who are uninvited visitors to this territory. So especially those of us who are white.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure. Now, like I was saying, I started to learn about this year, and in Canada Day this year, when there was kind of on Twitter, it's like this kind of war between the all the people celebrating and all the people being like, this is basically Canadian Genocide Day. And so I spent the better part of July 1st, 2020 researching, and I ended up making a video, which is also on my YouTube channel, that I talk about the history that I learned about, which you just covered parts of. So thank you for sharing that. Definitely, I agree, it's very important. And that's, like I said, I wanted to start talking to my guests and see if they do know, and if not, maybe we can just look it up and say, okay, well, now we can learn about the different Indigenous communities that are in these different areas. Yeah. And you can go to native-land.ca, which shows a world map that's got quite a bit on it. So that's a good place to start for sure.
Yeah, it's a good starting place. It isn't somewhere that I think people should end. There have been some critiques of that site that I think are legitimate. But it can be a good start for a lot of people. I think one of the main things that's important when we do land acknowledgements is making sure that, we're not talking about Indigenous people as if they're people of the past, because I think that is something that a lot of people do. And I see happen. And, as I noted, like today, Toronto is home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And, as somebody of mostly French Canadian descent, I certainly have my own historical connections and ancestry that is important to me. But, it's one for me to also, recognize that I don't have current cultural connections other than the communities that I've gotten to be, a guest at their ceremonies, which I am always grateful for. And so for anybody who doesn't know where those land acknowledgements actually come from, it's actually one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in regards to the Indian residential school system here in Canada, and that is just one of many recommendations that are there, and I highly recommend people read the recommendations. Some of them are directed entirely towards government, but then there's others that are more widely applicable, like land acknowledgements. So.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we got to cover that. And it sort of feels a bit awkward now to move into an unrelated topic, but I'm not quite sure where to put that makes the most sense. But yeah, so the next question in our kind of regular series of questioning here is, when you were a child, do you remember what you wanted to be or to do when you grew up?
I wanted to either be an archaeologist or a paleontologist.
Ooh,
Yeah. I mean, the study of things that came before has always been really interesting to me. I don't know why I didn't consider going into history, because I never did. Even though I love history. Like, I'm a history wonk by far, especially. My niches being queer and trans history, maybe not surprisingly. And my last job was actually at what's now just known as the Archives, which is the second largest LGBTQ archives in the world, second only to the one archives in California. So definitely in my last job, I actually got to pursue some of that love and energy in regards to history, but digging things up from the ground seemed like a great way to go, but it's not the way I went. I ended up moving away from that pretty early on, but it was definitely where I wanted to go, even if I didn't go that route.
No, that's so good. So it sounds like you still are kind of, I guess, not necessarily studying like dinosaur bones, but you're still studying cultures. You're still learning. So you're still doing something related. So yeah, just because the reason I sort of asked that question is because I'm curious how often the guest was interested in something early on and actually ended up doing that. Whether the interest ended up changing or whether it was just circumstances kind of ended up steering them away, and that's kind of how it happened.
No, I mean, the love of dinosaurs kind of went by the wayside for me. But I've always been fascinated by culture. I've always been fascinated by history. I've always been fascinated by power relations within that. I wound up with a social work degree, but I started in political science for that reason, because I find those interactions being one of the most interesting things. And being, now in inclusion and inclusion, diversity, and belonging education, or DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion field. It's still power relations at the end of the day, and it's still analyzing people at the end of the day, but in a slightly different way. I mean, I have a fascination with ancient history as well, and that's less applicable to my current work. But if you want to ask me stories about Old Norse history or queer and trans, more contemporary history, I have plenty of stories of both.
I might just have to ask you about the Norse stuff on the bonus episode, because I'm intrigued by that. So the next question, this one's a bit of kind of I don't know the age of all my guests, but I think I'm going to formulate the question this way now. So at the age of 30, whether you've already passed it or whether it's coming up, where were you in relation to your goals or your kind of aspirations, or where you think you'll be if you're not there yet?
At 30 was kind of a changing point for me in many ways. I was at the archives still at the time, though I knew that wasn't going to continue long term because of some changes that were going on. My goals in life have constantly been changing. I kind of got to the point where I was like, I need a master's, and I'll get my master's, and then I'll figure out the rest of my life. And I did that in my 20s, early to mid 20s, and then I got past that and kind of went, well, we'll see where my life goes from here. I've not I don't know where I want to go next. I don't actually have those types of life goals as much anymore, other than consistent progress in my life. So I don't really have something necessarily to compare it to, because I had accomplished the main things that I want. But at the end of the day, what I care about is community, is love. Like, I'm a romantic, with in a very happy relationship with my partner, and we're polyamorous, and yeah. So I think in many ways, I've reached those goals, and then some of my other goals are things that require complete societal change. So I don't know where we're going to get with that one, and definitely wasn't there in when I hit 30. So because we're not as inclusive a society as I would like. So.
Yeah, for sure. Again, just to kind of, I feel like for each episode, there's certain things I need to reiterate, although the regular viewers are probably going to get sick of hearing them. But kind of the point of that question is because, like, as part of this whole thing of, like, what we wanted to do, what we're actually doing, how we got there, how we're trying to get there. And there's this prevailing cultural narrative about, like, you're supposed to have everything figured out by the time you're 30. So that's why I'm asking people. And I guess if you can't, maybe, and I'm trying to find like the right ways to kind of to frame it and have follow-ups. And so if you were to give advice, what advice would you give to someone who's hasn't hit 30 yet and feels like they're just lost and they're not really sure what to do?
I think everybody has those moments of being lost, and it doesn't necessarily track with age. Like, I think sometimes it's easier to get lost when we're younger because we haven't had as many experiences to base things off of. And that's one of the reasons why I think intergenerational friendships are really important, is, get friends who are seniors who, are members of the same community as you, or even not members of the same community in whatever way that is, whether that's, locality or identity or whatever that is. And, really listen to their stories, and the prevailing narrative is none of us know what we're doing.
We like to think sometimes.
And the people who tell you they know what they're doing, I don't trust those people. Yeah, I'm of the opinion that we're all figuring things out, right? Like, I'm in my 30s now, and I've just figured out some of my own neurodiversity stuff, for instance, which, like, I went through all of my 20s knowing that I was somewhat weird, for sure, but not knowing why. And now only in my 30s am I actually being able to process those things and figure those things out. But on other aspects, I had things figured out when I was a teenager that other people that I know who are in their 30s now are only figuring out now, right? So, like, my gender identity, my sexual orientation, things like that, where those things came to me really quickly and easily, but other parts of me didn't. And I think we all have parts of ourselves that don't come as quickly and easily for us. And it doesn't matter whether you're like 15, 22, 30, or 60, we all have learning to do. It's all about our openness, and our willingness to strive to look at those pieces of ourselves, right? And to also say that we don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And that's kind of why I'm starting to ask this question of all my guests. And I do also want to say for both the video, the YouTube audience and the podcast audience that so far I've had mostly people kind of around my age and younger. And I do absolutely intend to have guests on in the future who are older, whether it's 40, 50, 60, maybe even older, because I want to get the different perspectives and really see how those experiences and insights kind of compare to each other. But yeah, you also touched on the next thing on our list, handy enough. You brought up kind of the issue of like neurodiversity, and we like to talk about mental health on this show because it's something that I think that most people do deal with, and it's starting to get talked about a lot more, but I think it's still I think that's something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should, and it's usually cast in a much more negative light. And so yeah, if you are open to it, talk about any mental health struggles or things like that you've experienced and how you worked through them.
For sure. So, I mean, there's only so much detail I'll give about some of these pieces, but yeah, I've struggled with anxiety and depression since I was very young, and those have impacted in suicidal behaviors and actions, and I've had quite a few rough patches in my life. I'm doing pretty well now, considering, but I haven't always been here. And that's not to say that I'm doing great anyway, because it's still a global pandemic. And if you're doing well right now, I think there's something perhaps more abnormal about that at the moment than if you're not doing well right now. Like, if you're not doing well right now, I think that's perfectly understandable, right? And so in terms of my own life, like, that has been part of my narrative, part of my story. And it's only kind of now that, like, I understand myself better, that I also understand where I was in those moments. But a lot of those moments have also been impacted by external factors, right? Like, if you don't have a stable home, it's understandable you have some challenges with your mental health. Like, if you are experiencing discrimination on a daily basis, like, it's understandable that you have issues with your mental health. If you don't have a supportive network of people around you all the time, it's understandable to have issues with your mental health. And so I've had those moments throughout my life in different ways. And I mean, as you might imagine, coming out as a trans person and to everybody back in the early 2000s was not easy, especially when you're public about it and you're putting yourself in a public activist stage. I've experienced a lot of death threats over my life. And I am glad that I hear many trans people who have not had those experiences these days, which I'm very grateful for, actually, because I don't want to see that repeated for other people. But I know people go through that too. And I think the most important thing through all of that is being vulnerable. And, vulnerability is a strength, and it's something that I don't think I entirely understood for a good chunk of my life. And if I had, maybe my mental health would have been better, because I would have been vulnerable with the right people. I would have gotten the support that I needed. And, I used to do youth mental health, mental illness outreach. And one of the things that we would say is that, everybody has a mental health. Like, it's just part of your overall health. And, some of us might have mental illnesses, but those can come and go, right? So there's some people who have a mental illness, which it's impacting your life all like throughout your entire life. But if you've managed to get the medications that you need, the therapies that you need, the support you need, all of those types of things, you can still be mentally well. So I don't think anybody should have any shame about when they're not being well. And I think, people need to be a bit more vulnerable and look for a bit more support. And that's what's done well for me.
Yeah, and that's something that came up on a previous episode as well, was the kind of issue because of the stigma. A lot of people put off getting help that they need. And there was something else I was going to say, and then there was a car honk and I lost it. For the people watching, you can see little nameplates at the bottom of the screen, and I hope it's not too distracting that I mute myself a lot, because I never know, and my microphone's very sensitive, so I'm trying to minimize the background noise to continue rolling things on. I'm not sure, like, I've been trying to keep these episodes to roughly kind of a 30 to 45 minute range, but my feeling is if the content is good, if the discussion's good, then it can go a bit longer. So the next thing, we're getting into a little bit lighter subject matter now. again, things that kind of play into how we function and how we thrive in the world. And so new question that I'm going to add in, it's come up before, but I'm officially asking it now, is do you consider yourself an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert?
So I used to call myself an introvert, despite the fact that I have a very outgoing life. But I don't know that I subscribe to those terms anymore, really, because especially with understanding my neurodiversity a bit more, it kind of nullifies some of that understanding of like why I was getting emotionally drained by interacting with people. Because really that's what introversion is about, is that you gain that energy in more private spaces or by yourself, versus extroversion where you gain that energy from being around people. And it really depends, right? Like it depends on who those people are, how many people are around, whether like the space is supportive or not. And so all of those things come into factor when it comes to, my emotional energy and how much energy that I have to give in a day. So like some days I'm very, very active, but I always need a role. If I have a role, that's why I do well in work situations, because I have a role, I know what I need to do, I go to execute it, all of those things. Doesn't matter if there's a bunch of people around, I can speak in front of 100 people and it's not an issue. You give me a social party with 12 people that I don't know everybody super, super closely and intimately, I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to find that space draining. So it really, for me, those terms are holding less weight than they used to because of understanding my neurodiversity and understanding what brings me energy and what doesn't bring me energy. It has less to do with the amount of people and more to do with the types of people, the space, and things of that nature.
Yeah, I definitely relate to your experience. I know that I am naturally more introverted, but I call myself a social introvert. I do enjoy talking to people, but I can only do so much of it. And this kind of also plays into, you kind of mentioned like energy levels. And so that's something else that I like to ask about is, do you think you have like a peak time of day, whether it's like morning, night, or just kind of somewhere whenever?
So this is actually a question that was brought up to me recently, where I was only given the options of being an early bird or a night owl. And then I said, I am neither of those. How are you going to fit me in? And actually they changed a question as a result of that. I don't like binaries. I find I tend to be the most productive between like 10 a.m. to like 6 p.m. That's generally the time frame that works really well for me. Before that is usually too early for me, and I'm struggling. And after that, it's not that I'm necessarily struggling. It's that like I've already expended so much energy doing whatever I've been doing in that day that usually by that time I'm exhausted. Especially as somebody with chronic illness, chronic pain. Usually by that point in the day, I'm in pain. I need to lie down. I don't have as much energy. And so the closest I would say would be a midday person. Is really kind of the truth. So
yeah, well, that's why like I think I did start asking these questions as binaries, and I've kind of realized like they're like nothing like, well, a lot of these things aren't like strict one or the others. There can be in between, like social introverts or loner extroverts. And so yeah, like I want people to be honest, and if they don't feel they fit well into either and they're just something else, then that's totally valid. And I think more people should hear about that so that they don't feel like they have to be one or the other, because again, like it's kind of visibility and representation. That's kind of the end of the formal questioning, and we're at a pretty good time here, so I guess we'll do our plug. Yeah, I should say we'll do your plugs because mine come at the end as like a graphic. So where can people find you online and find the work that you do and contact you if they want to do so?
So they can certainly find me through Pride at Work Canada, being jade.pichette at prideatwork.ca. If you go to prideatwork.ca, you'll be able to find my email. I also do independent consulting, which if people were trying to find me independently as a diversity inclusion consultant or spiritual care consultant type of thing, they would go through my consulting website at www.jadepichette.com, all one word, or consulting at jadepichette.com. I also am on LinkedIn quite regularly. It's very weird, I have to say, that I now have a job where I'm an active LinkedIn user. I feel weird about myself. And yeah, I don't know how to deal with that yet. I will someday come to terms with the fact that I am one of those people. And also I am on Twitter, but not the most active on Twitter. You'll find me suddenly at a conference tweeting a lot, and then between conferences, not so much. And especially as we have no in-person conferences right now, just not so much in general. But yeah, those are the main places that people can find me. In terms of my Gythia stuff, that tends to be things that are mostly more private. But if somebody did want to reach out to me, they could reach out through my consulting email for that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I will definitely be putting, it's good that you say it out loud for the podcast listeners, for the people watching the video, that'll be up on the screen. So I do that, and it'll be in the description below. So yeah, now we can do our goodbye with the hats, which is a fun little tradition that started here. So far, everybody has agreed to partake, and yeah,
doesn't quite fit either with my hair.
I know. You can never do them with the headphones on, which is actually it's supposed to be like this. Yeah, see, it's like we I was gonna say, like, I normally like to take the headphones off and put them on properly, but that's kind of funny. So we can just stick with this. So thank you for oh yes, it will have been on the screen, but I gotta remember to say it for the podcast listeners. You can find out more about this show if you go to hatcollecting.com. That's the official website, and I try to say there'll be lots of links and information in the description. And for the bonus episode, which we'll be doing next, that goes out on my Patreon, and I still have to look into the coffee thing, kofi.com/ArtemisCreates, but I'm going to try to put some stuff there too if I can. So yeah, if you want to see more of us and hear more from Jade and talk about, I guess, the Norse mythology and anything else that they want to geek out about, you can head over to Patreon, and look forward to seeing you there. So thank you for watching, and we are now waving goodbye with our black hats.